Wait, let
Hello,
me.
good morning. Today our guest is Professor Luigi Pascali, and we're going to be talking about steamships and globalization. So, Professor Pascali, you wrote a paper some time ago titled The Wind of Change, Maritime Technology, Trade and Economic Development. What is this paper about?
Well, this paper really tries to understand what is the impact of globalization on economic development. And, it looks at it in a particular setting. That is the first wave of trade globalization in the second half of the 19th century. Practically, we observed, like from 1870 to 1913, a huge increase in international trade all over the world. Practically the share of trade out of world GDP, it doubles in these years. And what I was trying to do with this paper is try to understand, first of all, what explains this gigantic increase in trade, and second, what were the impacts of the first wave of trade globalization on economic development all over the world. And pretty much this is what the paper is about.
Luigi, what drove trade routes prior to the invention of steamships?
Yeah, so you need to think that before the steamship, of course, the prevailing shipping technologies was the sailing ship. And you can imagine that with this technology, the sort of trade routes and trade distances are somehow defined by winds. This explains, for instance, why trade was triangular in the Northern Atlantic. In the Northern Atlantic, winds tend to go in a clockwise manner, and therefore trade routes are going to follow winds. So normally what you would have is Europe exporting cheap manufacturers to Africa, Africa exporting slaves to the Caribbeans, and the Caribbeans exporting commodities to Europe. Again, if we look at the trade data, for instance, we observe that Portugal was exporting to Cape Verde a lot, but Cape Verde was not exporting to Portugal. Why? Again, because of the winds. Brazil, from a geographical point of view, was far away with respect to all the main trade centers of the world, but it was really at the center of the trade network because of the prevailing winds in the Northern Atlantic. If you wanted to trade from Europe to anywhere in East Africa or Asia or Australia, you were constrained at one point to pass in front of Brazil because of the particular winds. And then the steamship arrives, and somehow, suddenly, there is a big asymmetric shock to trade distances.
Luigi, did trade and urbanization lead to rising incomes?
So that's a great question. So let me speak mainly about the first part of this question. It is, what is the impact of trade on economic development? So if we look at the data today, we observe that generally rich countries are countries that trade more. Okay, so there is a strong correlation between trade and economic development. Now, the question is whether this correlation is causal, whether it is really trade that explains higher level of economic development. And let me say that there is like a lot of literature that has somehow convincingly shown that trade seems to be beneficial, at least on average, for economic development around the world today. When I look at the 19th century, somehow things are much more blurry. In fact, at least, if we believe the results of my analysis, what I get is that trade is not beneficial for economic development to the average individual of the world. Okay, at least the average individual that is in one of those countries that are part of my sample. This doesn't mean that trade is always bad. What I find is actually that trade leads to higher level of economic development for a small core of rich countries with good institutions. while for the majority of the world, it seems that at least the first wave of trade globalization was associated with strong specialization in agriculture and a decreasing of the standard of living.
Luigi, steamships, in what period did they really start to alter the global trade?
Yes. So what I find in the paper is that like these shocking distances that are generated by this new technology, they translate in completely different patterns of trade between the 1860s and the 1870s. Now, notice that this is exactly the moment at which the first wave of trade globalization kicks in. So in a sense, I think one of the main points of the paper is arguing that the main reason behind this huge increase in trade across nations is this new technology.
Luigi, in your paper, you mentioned the Great Divergence. Did the advent of global trade reverse fortunes in some areas?
So that's, I'm not sure whether, whether you have a reverse of fortune due to the first wave of trade globalization. But what the data seems to show is that actually rich countries were exactly those that ended up benefiting from trade. Okay, so countries that were rich to start with and that had good institutions in the sense that there was rule of law and there were constraints on the executive power, they ended up, when the world opened up, they ended up specializing in manufacturing. And this led to higher level of urbanization and higher level of economic development, at least according to the measures that we have for economic development for this period. On the other side, what we observe are poor countries, and in general, countries that have poor institutions ended up becoming relatively poorer. So in a sense, there is a divergence that actually is particularly reinforced in these years and seems to be caused by the first wave of trade globalization.
Did the steamship reduce transportation costs? And in your response, you can talk about the role of freight rates.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So what we observe is that wherever the steamship starts to be used, we observe a big reduction in freight rates. And it's you have a big reduction in transportation cost, and you have also a big reduction in the times it takes to move across different nations. I mean, just imagine like if you want to ship something from Europe to the Americas, like really, you had no clue on when you would arrive there, because like everything would depend on the winds that you would get. And now suddenly you have a technology that allows you to be there, at a time that you can forecast and you can plan. And on the top of this, yes, these are much cheaper options compared to sailing ships.
And Luigi, should we really use freight rates as a proxy to determine this measurement?
You mean to measure trade costs?
Yes, because you said the typical methodology applied in this literature is to regress exports on freight rates and then to calculate what share of the increase in trade after 1870 can be explained by the contemporaneous reduction in freight rates. My paper addresses a major identification issue. Freight rates are endogenous because they're likely to be affected not only by technology, but also by changes in economic activity or market structure.
Absolutely, yes. So we need to think about freight rates as prices, yes? So prices reflect on one side changes in technology, but also on the other side, they reflect the changes in the demand. So what the usual literature used to do is somehow, well, here maybe I should, let me speak more about my paper. That is, there what I try to do is I try to show the causal impact of this technology on changes in freight rates. And I can do this because, again, this technology generates an asymmetric change in trade distances, okay? And then I can see what is the effects of this asymmetric change in trade distances, which is exogenous, is uncorrelated with the demand, it's just correlated with wind patterns. I can see what is the impact of this on prices. And yes, we do observe like that places where the steamship was giving big advantages, because before, you just could not go there because of wind patterns. In these places, we observe a big reduction in freight rates.
Luigi, you also talk about executive constraints and institutions. What role did institutions play in fostering development?
Yes. So let me tell you that there is a huge literature, a literature that has convincingly shown that institutions, they do matter for economic development. And in particular, that institutions do matter, particularly in a globalized world. In a world that is not globalized, practically what you have is that countries tend to have similar sectoral composition. When the world opens up, country specializes. And the usual idea is that having constraints executives and rule of law, it gives a competitive advantage in manufacturing. So places that had good institutions, again, according to the literature, they ended up specializing in manufacturing. And through a series of mechanisms, manufacturing is beneficial for economic development. Okay. On the other side, places that had bad institutions, they ended up specializing in agriculture, and agriculture is bad. Now, this is the story that is out there. Is a story that I think has been, has been proved by a huge literature. In a sense, my results, they confirm this story. So what I find is that places that had constrained executives, they ended up specializing in manufacturing when they open up to trade, and they ended up benefiting from trade. Now, let me, however, tell you that mine is not like a bulletproof kind of empirical analysis on this. The fact that I find that places with good institutions, they ended up benefiting from the first wave of trade globalization doesn't mean that they benefited because they had good institutions, okay? Normally, places that have good institutions, they also have a larger share of Europeans. They are characterized by a higher level of human capital. They are richer to start with. So let me put it like this, that is, this part of my paper is more a correlation that seems to confirm a story that is there in the previous literature.
And Luigi?
Yes.
Yeah, in your response, I would really love it if you would talk about institutional constraints, because this is also another important point referenced in your paper. You compared unlimited authority to limited authority, and you found a difference.
Yes. So again, generally what I find is that whenever the constraints has to respond to the rule of law, and you have this trade shock, you ended up specializing in manufacturing, you ended up urbanizing, and you ended up with higher level of per capita GDP. Okay. On the other side, when you have absolute monarchy, unconstrained executives, again, you ended up specializing in agriculture, and you ended up with lower level of economic development. Okay. Now, again, let me emphasize the fact that this doesn't mean that institutions are crucial for economic development. Okay. This means just that places that have good institutions, they ended up benefiting from the globalized world. But again, places that have good institutions, they have a set of other characteristics that might explain these results.
Luigi, so in your earlier response, you mentioned Europeans share the population, and I've seen studies examine a link between Europeans and human capital. What's so special about the human capital of Europeans?
So that's a tough question to address. So let's put it like this. First of all, the knowledge of Europeans, when, for instance, they discovered the Americas, was way superior with respect to the indigenous population in so many aspects. Literacy, they just had much more advanced technologies. Somehow the Europeans also, they seem to have some traits which are conducive to economic development. Again, this is not my research, and is not, I do not necessarily agree with this. But for instance, individualism seems higher among Europeans. If we look at least Protestant Europe, literacy rates are extremely high. Also, like, there were some parts of Europe that were used to representative institutions already from the Middle Ages. So these are some special characteristics that Europeans have. But again, this is somehow unrelated with this paper of mine.
Yes, but you mentioned it, and it's frequently mentioned in several papers. So I just had to talk about it.
Yes, absolutely.
Luigi, the Americas are quite interesting. You also explored how trade impacted the Americas. Why is this region different? What really happened during the first wave of globalization? Did the region get richer or poorer? What happened?
Yeah, so what we observe in the second half of the 19th century is a big divergence within the Americas, with Northern and Southern America becoming relatively richer compared to Central America. Okay, and now the question is why? Again, the usual idea relates with this divergence with differences in institutions. Okay, so the usual idea is that Europeans, when they colonized the Americas, they ended up bringing good institutions in places where there were no people, because you had to convince Europeans to move there. And they ended up bringing extractive institutions in places where there were a lot of people, and there was already a state and complex hierarchies that were already there, where the Europeans could just cut the head and keep the same extractive institutions, the same tributary systems that were there before their arrival. Okay, so if you look at, again, North of America and Southern America, when the Europeans arrived, these places were already less populated. And when the Europeans arrived, practically almost everybody died there, okay? Mainly because of the germs that were brought by the Europeans. So now you have to convince people to move there. And of course, you don't convince people to move there if you impose in these places institutions that practically enslave people, okay? So that's why you ended up with relatively good institutions, according to the previous literature, in North and South America, and places with extremely extractive institutions in Central America. Again, before the world's globalized, this did not matter much. This did not matter because what you have is just agriculture everywhere. Of course, it mattered for the standard of living of people, but it did not matter in terms of differences in per capita GDP, for instance. But then the world globalized, okay? And then, again, specialization kicks in. And at that point, places that have good institutions, they ended up benefiting a lot from this. And again, what I find in my data is sort of corroborates the story. And what you see there is again, this big divergence between North-South on one side and Central and Caribbean America on the other side.
Luigi, I'm on page 20, so I read your paper. When I'm doing interviews, I like to have a copy of the paper in front of me. It makes the interview easier to follow.
Yes.
Yes. So I'm on page 20. And I'm on the last paragraph on page 20.
Okay, let me take page 20 because I don't really remember what is there, and then we can be both on the same page. Let me see. Oof. Okay, here there is not. Okay, here I don't have the pages here, but tell me what is the question, and I'm sure I will remember.
A potential concern with using urbanization rates as a proxy for economic development is that the first wave of globalization induced the majority of countries outside of Europe to specialize in commodity export. Explain this case.
Sorry, I'm not entirely sure what. Okay, it's page 20, yes?
Yes.
Let me see, one. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Okay, I don't have this on my page 20.
No, I am reading your paper that was published on Warwick site.
Okay.
Yes,
okay.
that's
So
the paper that I'm reading.
Okay. Sorry, I'm scared that this disappeared in the version that was published. So let me, because I put potential concern and I don't see this. So you're reading my Warwick working paper, yes?
Yes. Well, not. I will see if I can. Oh, I can't send the copy, but I'll just send it to your mail and you can look at it.
Yes. Okay, got the email. it's page 20.
Yes, page 20.
Oh, yes. Yeah, so what happened? So the point here is that we don't have a perfect measure for economic development for this particular period, okay? So if we want to measure the standard of living in the second half of the 19th century for the majority of countries in the world, I mean, unfortunately, we don't have good data, okay? We have estimates of per capita GDP, which are extremely noisy. Normally, we know that higher level of economic development, they come with higher urbanization rates. And so urbanization rates is another measure that I try to use for economic development. And finally, if we think that the world is Malthusian, economic development here in the sense of technological development is expected to be correlated with population density. Okay, so this is why I use these three measures for economic development in the paper. Estimates of per capita GDP, again, extremely noisy, urbanization rates, and population density. Now, each of these three measures has problems, okay? Measures of per capita GDP, again, they are extremely noisy. It's extremely difficult to believe them fully. Measures of urbanization rates, they are likely to be correlated not only with the level of economic development, standard of living, GDP, but also with actually the sectoral specialization of the country, okay? So they are likely to capture this as well. And regarding population density, I think it's pretty much very clear why this is not a perfect measure of economic development. So what I try to do in the paper is try to show the impact of globalization in these three measures and somehow show that these three measures, they tend to co-move. Okay, so each of them has problems, but when like the results are consistent across these three measures, and this is just the best that we can do. Okay, so in this particular paragraph, I was explaining what is the problems of using urbanization rates if you want to measure the economic development of the country. The problem is that urbanization rates are highly correlated with how much this country specializes in manufacturing compared to agriculture. And that's it.
Yes, and Luigi, there's also another argument that deindustrialization occurred in the developing world. Is this accurate?
It is very accurate. I think the showcase is India. If we look at India in the 19th century, you need to think that at the beginning of the century, the share of manufacturing in India, according to several estimates, was close to the one that you would get in Europe. By the end of the century, it was not comparable anymore.
And in your article, you cite Jeffrey Williams quite a bit. Are his findings different from mainstream research?
So in a sense, my findings are different with respect to the great majority of literature in international trade, which I've looked at, recent years. So if we look at the last 50 years, I think what you would get is the great majority of studies, they found a positive impact of globalization economic development, at least when you look at large regions. Some countries, they might have lose from it. Some groups of the population, they might have lose from it. But generally, there is this idea that globalization is good for economic development. And in a sense, this was, I think, the first paper that was, mine was the first paper that was showing, like, in a well-identified econometric framework, that you can have negative impact if you look at, you know, a large region. And again, this was the case for the first wave of trade globalization. Now, let me tell you already that there were some historians that, of course, they had noticed this before. And Williamson, who is one of the giants in this literature, is highly cited in my paper exactly because of this reason. Now, historians, they normally don't work with regressions and with large data sets, but they work more like with anecdotal evidence and with data sets that specialize to a particular country or particular regions. Williamson somehow had worked in this manner in this book, Trade and Poverty. And somehow the findings were very much similar. The idea is very much similar to what I find in my paper, using, again, this large data set and this novel identification strategy. Yeah.
Well, Luigi, I don't know if you listened to that interview, but I interviewed Jeffrey Williamson some time ago.
Oh, wow. I didn't listen to this interview.
Yes, I am a big fan of Jeffrey Williamson. I just think he's a genius.
He is really a giant.
Yeah, because he's in his 80s, not really working now. But when we were speaking, he has a challenge with his site, but he just knew the papers really well. Like, he was teaching me. He was interviewing me. He was asking me questions.
Oh, fantastic!
In his 80s, yeah. Yes, he was really sharp.
I mean, these are those giants on which, like, our profession sits. Sincerely, when I think about my paper, is just a small application tries to test his work, and is fully and completely inspired by
and he was also a good teacher. Few academics can be smart and likable.
Yes, I agree.
Few academics can be smart and likable.
Absolutely. I mean, this guy is fantastic. All over.
So have you met him?
I did meet him.
Okay.
I don't know if he remembers about me, but I definitely, remember about him. Yeah.
All right. Thanks for coming on, Luigi.
It was great to speak with you, Lipton. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.